Good morning to all. Today's class is phosphorus. Actually, they are printed that iron today's topic, but that is wrong mistake. So today's topic is phosphorus, and in the next class, I will take that iron class. So phosphorus in the last session we are finishing the calcium. If you understand the calcium class, it is very easy to understand the phosphorus also, because most of the phosphorus along with the calcium that is participated in the main function. Okay, so today's topic is phosphorus. So it is a mineral. Next to calcium, phosphorus is the most abundant mineral in the human body. Most abundant mineral, most of the amount that is required for human body. Next to calcium. So phosphorus, that atomic number is 15 and the molecular weight is 30. Okay. So most of the phosphorus that is present, the average is 70 to 75 kgs of body weight of the humans. They are containing 0.7 to 0.80 kgs. Okay, 0.7 to 0.8 kgs. Okay, so in that amount, 80 to 85% that is present in the bones and the teeth. So here 80 to 85% that is along with the calcium that binds with the phosphorus that forms a hydroxyapatite crystals. So these hydroxyapatite crystals, they deposited in the bones and the teeth, 80 to 85%. Remaining 50 to 20% only that is present in the intracellular fluid. Okay, 15 to 20% intracellular fluid in tissues as organic phosphate. Okay, here you can remember that intracellular phosphate is organic phosphate. Okay, only 0.1% that is present in the extracellular fluid. So in the extracellular fluid that is present as a inorganic phosphate. So organic phosphate is intracellular fluid that is present in, and extracellular fluid is containing inorganic phosphate. So this is the total amount. So, but in the blood, how much of inorganic phosphate that is present? So, in the blood means that is extracellular fluid, plasma. Okay, plasma inorganic phosphate level is infants less than 1 year. Infants 4.5 to 6 milligrams per deciliter. 4.5 to 6 milligrams per deciliter. In the adults, those are containing little bit less amount with compared to infants. Adults containing 2.5 to 4.5 milligrams per deciliter. Okay. So here in the infants blood, in infants blood, they are containing little bit more amount with compared to adults. Why? Because infants for the phosphorus they are depending on the mother's milk. So mother's milk containing phosphoprotein. Okay, mother's milk containing phosphoprotein. What type of phosphoprotein mother's milk containing? Casein. Casein is the milk protein. Phosphorus containing protein. Okay. Plasma phosphorus exists in 3 forms. So in the plasma phosphorus that is exists in 3 forms. What are those? Organic and inorganic. So organic phosphate that is present in intracellular fluid, intracellular substances, organic phosphate. Inorganic phosphate that is present in extracellular fluid. Okay. So in the extracellular fluid, phosphate, inorganic phosphate, that is mainly 2 types, monovalent and divalent. Valency electron minus 2. So that's why it is minus monovalent and divalent. So most of the serum that is containing 3 types of forms. What are those? 55% that is present as a free form. Okay, it is not binding with the any other substances. Free phosphate that is present about 55%. Okay, about 35% that is present as a complex with the cations. Phosphate that is negatively charged ions, phosphate containing negatively charged ions. So it is complexed with the positive cations. So what are those? Sodium, calcium, magnesium. These are all cations. About 35% of the phosphorus that is complexed with these cations. Remaining 10%, only 10%, that is protein bound phosphate in the blood. Protein bound phosphate in the blood, that is about 10% only. So these are the different forms of the phosphate in the blood. What are the different biological functions? So in that biological functions, that the first function we know that we already discussed about this one in the calcium mineral. So here most of the 80 to 85% of the phosphorus that is participated in the formation of the bone along with the calcium. So along with the calcium that forms a hydroxyapatite crystals. So these hydroxyapatite crystals that forms a strong bond between the collagen fibers of the bone. Collagen fibers of the bone. So it helps to strongness of the bone. Okay. This is the first function. Second function. So phosphate is required for synthesis of phospholipid. So this is the phospholipid. You know that phospholipid, it is a membrane lipid. So phospholipid containing hydrophilic part, hydrophobic part. Okay. So most of the hydrophilic part that is containing phosphate ions. So phosphate that is present at the hydrophilic portion of the phospholipid. So it is a membrane lipid. Next one is formation of various bioorganic substances. Formation of various bioorganic substances. So what are those? Nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, that the backbone ribose sugars combined together by these phosphate ions, DNA and RNAs. Next one is coenzymes. So here, for example, NAD, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, and nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate. So here, NAD that is containing two phosphate ions combined with the two ribose sugars. Okay. In the NADP, it is having the extra phosphate at ribose sugar. One ribose sugar is having one extra phosphate ions. Okay. This is about coenzymes. Next one is nucleotides, adenosine monophosphate, adenosine diphosphate, guanosine triphosphate. These are all nucleotides. So nucleotides also containing phosphate ions. Okay, nucleotides also containing phosphate ions. So here you can see cyclic adenosine monophosphate. It is a second messenger. So here that difference is cyclic AMP and AMP difference is here two oxygen ions from the phosphate ion that binds with the two carbon atoms. This is called cyclic AMP. But in the only adenosine monophosphate, like NADP, one phosphate group that is attached to the ribose sugar. So that is the difference between adenosine monophosphate and cyclic adenosine monophosphate. So here adenosine monophosphate is the nucleotide. Cyclic adenosine monophosphate is the second messenger. It is participated in secondary action of the enzyme reaction. Okay, inside the cell. So this is the another functions. Next one is here phosphate is required for energy metabolism. So there are different types of metabolic reactions that is taking place. So for that metabolic reaction, during the metabolic reactions, what is the why that the metabolic reactions that is taking place? That is producing energy. And also for the metabolic reactions that is required, for the process of metabolic reactions require energy. So for that energy, there's some energy that is stored as a high energy phosphate. So that high energy phosphate examples are creatine phosphate and adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate. So creatine phosphate, you know that it is stored in the muscle. So when energy required our body, that the phosphate group that is separated from the creatine, then that is participated in the metabolic reactions to proceed to produce energy. Okay, so this is the high energy phosphates. Those are containing phosphate ions. So here this is the formation of the creatine phosphate. So here creatine that is binds with the one phosphate ions taking from the adenosine triphosphate. So these one phosphate that is attached to the creatine, that forms a creatine phosphate that is stored in the muscle. Okay, so when our energy required, that the phosphate group that is separated, and this phosphate that is participated in different metabolic reactions like carbohydrate metabolism. So phosphate is required for carbohydrate metabolism. So carbohydrates metabolism, for example, glycolysis, breakdown of glucose, how it is taking place? Glucose first converted to the glucose 6 phosphate. So one phosphate that is binds with the 6th carbon atom of the glucose, that is glucose 6 phosphate. Next one is fructose 6 phosphate, glucose 6 phosphate dehydrogenase. So like that, different products, those are producing different phosphate ions binding with the different products of the breakdown of the glucose. Okay, so that is carbohydrate metabolism. Another function is phosphate is acts as a intracellular buffer. So most of the phosphate ions, those are present intracellularly. So intracellular phosphate, what is the function of intracellular phosphate? That it acts as a buffer that regulates the pH concentration in the intracellular fluid. That is the action of the buffer. What are the daily requirements and the sources? Like a calcium, infants require 400 milligrams per day. Okay, children require 800 to 1200 milligrams per day. Adult require 800 milligrams per day. Okay, these are the different sources. In that sources, milk and milk products are having high amount of phosphate. Okay, high amount of phosphate as a casein, milk protein. Okay, phosphorus containing protein casein. Okay, so like that, some amount of the phosphate that is present in the seafoods and non-vegetarian foods. Eggs also containing phosphorus. Some leafy vegetables are containing phosphorus. Some cereals, some legumes, some seeds, those are all containing phosphorus. These are the different sources. So when we are taking different sources of the phosphorus, how the phosphorus that is enters into the intestine, what is the further function? So foods containing phosphorus, when we are taking, that absorption that is taking place in the intestine, especially jejunum and gutter. Okay, here that absorption of the phosphorus that is taking place. So absorption that is mainly depending on the vitamin D3. So vitamin D3 that regulates absorption of the phosphorus in the intestine, like calcium. Okay, so whatever absorbed phosphate that is enters into the blood. So after coming into the blood, some amount of the phosphorus again that is secreted into the intestine, again that is secreted into the intestine to form a gastric juice, digestive juice. Okay, remaining phosphorus that is and participated in the bone formation along with the calcium. Okay, along with the calcium. Remaining excess phosphorus that forms that is released into the blood. So this excess phosphorus that is excreted through the kidney. Okay, excess phosphorus that is excreted through the kidney. This is about absorption and a different function. Regulation of the plasma phosphorus. So how the regulation that is taking place in the blood. So in the blood, when the concentration of the phosphorus that is increased in above the range, that is called hyperphosphatemia. Okay, when the phosphorus phosphate concentration that is reduced below the normal range, that is called hypophosphatemia. Okay, so regulation of the phosphate that is handled by the bone, intestine, parathyroid gland, and kidney. Bone, intestine, parathyroid glands, and kidney. So, regulatory substances are parathyroid hormone released from the parathyroid gland, calcitriol that is released from the kidney, fibroblast growth factor that is released from the bone. So, how the regulation that is taking place? Now we are discussing. So, whenever we are taking sufficient amount of the phosphate containing substances that is reached to the intestine, then here intestinal absorption that is taking place. So here that absorbed phosphate that is enters into the blood. Okay. So here you have to remember that that regulation, it is always just opposite to the calcium regulation. Okay, it is opposite direction to the calcium regulation. So here phosphate concentration, when it is increased above the normal range, when it is increased above the normal range, parathyroid hormone that released from the parathyroid gland. Why I am saying it is opposite to the calcium regulation? So here parathyroid hormone, when it is released in the calcium regulation, when the calcium concentration is reduced in the blood, hypocalcemia, when it is occur, then only parathyroid hormone is released. But in the phosphorus, when the phosphate concentration is increased in the blood, then parathyroid hormone that is released. Okay, hypocalcemia, hyperphosphatemia, parathyroid hormone that appears in the blood. So then after release of the parathyroid hormone that acts on kidney as well as in the bone. Okay, so in the kidney, parathyroid hormone, when it is released from the parathyroid gland that is reached to the kidney, here more secretion of the phosphate that is taking place, more excretion of the phosphate that is taking place. So parathyroid hormone that acts on phosphorus in the tubules, here there is no, that reduces the phosphorus reabsorption, that increases the phosphorus excretion into the urine. Another function parathyroid hormone in the calcium reabsorption that is taking place. Okay, so due in the hyperparathyroidism, whenever increased above the normal range of the parathyroid hormone, that maybe produces hypophosphatemia and hypercalcemia, more calcium reabsorption, more phosphate excretion that is taking place. So that is hyperparathyroidism that produces hypercalcemia, hypophosphatemia. Okay, that is the action on kidney. Okay, another function parathyroid hormone that inhibits the 1-alpha hydroxylase activity. 1-alpha hydroxylase activity. So 1-alpha hydroxylase, it is an enzyme that participated in the activation of the vitamin D3. Okay, activation of the vitamin D3. So here hyperparathyroidism that reduces the 1-alpha hydroxylase activity. So that means that is not producing sufficient amount of the vitamin D3. So whenever vitamin D3 is greatly reduced formation, there is no action of the vitamin D3 in the intestine. So whenever vitamin D3 action not taking place in the intestine, there is no absorption of the phosphate in the intestine. So gradually that is reduced concentration, hypophosphatemia. Okay, another parathyroid hormone that acts on bone also. So whenever parathyroid hormone that acts on bone, bones are releasing fibroblast growth factor. Bones are releasing fibroblast growth factor. So this fibroblast growth factor that acts on 1-alpha hydroxylase enzyme. So this is also same action, 1 alpha hydroxylase activity that is reduced by the fibroblast growth factor. So vitamin D3 formation that is reduced. So whenever it is reduced, vitamin D3, there is no sufficient amount of the absorption in the intestine and phosphate. Okay. So this is about hyperparathyroidism. Next, hyperphosphatemia. Next one is hypophosphatemia. Whenever phosphate concentration in the blood that is reduced, this is activates the 1 alpha hydroxylase. Whenever phosphate concentration is reduced, that condition is called hypophosphatemia. And so in the hypophosphatemia, that activates the 1 alpha hydroxylase enzyme in the kidney. So whenever 1 alpha hydroxylase activity is increased, more vitamin D3 that is really produced in the kidney. More vitamin D3. So that more vitamin D3 that is released into the blood and reach to the intestine. So whenever reach to the intestine, more absorption of the phosphate in the intestine that is taking place. So hypophosphatemia that increases 1 alpha hydroxylase activity that releases vitamin D3, more vitamin D3 in the kidney. That vitamin D3 that acts on intestine, that more absorption of the phosphate that is taking place, that comes normal. Serum concentration that comes normal. So this is about regulation of the plasma phosphate. Okay, this is about regulation of the plasma phosphate. Next one is disorders of the phosphate deficiency. So already we know that whenever reduced concentration of the plasma, that is called hypophosphatemia. Whenever phosphate concentration is increased, that is called hyperphosphatemia. So hypophosphatemia, low concentration of the phosphate, it may be due to decreased gastrointestinal absorption. Decreased gastrointestinal absorption of the phosphate due to low diet intake or abnormal function of the intestine. Abnormal function of the intestine, any ulcers, any cause to thickness of the wall of the intestine, that may reduces the absorption of the phosphate. Next one is decreased renal tubular reabsorption. Decreased renal tubular reabsorption. So renal tubular reabsorption of the phosphate, that is mainly depending on the vitamin D3. So whenever vitamin D3 deficient, there is no reabsorption of the phosphate, that is greatly reduced. The phosphate excretion that is increased. Next one is hypercalcemia. So whenever hypercalcemia that is taking place, when the hyperparathyroidism. So when the hyperparathyroidism that is taking place, that is hypophosphatemia, that is excretion of more phosphate that is taking place. Okay. Next one is intracellular shift of the phosphate due to any damage to the cellular damage. In the due to cellular damage, more intracellular phosphate that is greatly shifted to the extracellular. Next one is hyperphosphatemia. Hyperphosphatemia, that means phosphate concentration that is greatly increased in the blood, is due to acute or chronic renal failure with the decreased GFR, glomerular filtration rate, that is greatly reduced due to chronic renal failure. There is no filtration. So excess amount of the phosphate that is accumulated in the blood due to renal failure. Next one is hypocalcemia. That is hypocalcemia that is depending on parathyroid hormone. Whenever hypoparathyroidism that is taking place, hypocalcemia that is taking place. When the parathyroid hormone is reduced, excretion of phosphate in the kidney that is reduced. So whenever it is reduced, that is accumulated in the blood. Hypocalcemia. And also hypoparathyroidism. just opposite to the these functions, hypophosphatemia. Next one is increased tubular reabsorption. Increased tubular reabsorption. When it is increased, when the vitamin D3 is increased, whenever we are taking more amount of vitamin D, especially now it is COVID time, everybody taking that vitamin D3 dose, 4 tablets every weekly once. So if we are taking excess amount of the vitamin D3, that may increases the tubular reabsorption of the phosphate ions. That may produces hyperphosphatemia. That may produces hyperphosphatemia. So don't take too much of the vitamin D3 due to this COVID season. Okay. Next one is increased cellular release of phosphate. Whenever cellular damage, that releases more amount of the phosphate into the extracellular. That may produces hyperphosphatemia. Okay. Next one is excess vitamin D intake. Already we discussed. So these are the two disorders: phosphate deficiency, hypophosphatemia, hyperphosphatemia. Okay. So this is about the phosphate ions. Thank you.